again, in a universe where you're a $90 billion company and you see your addressable market as $3 to $4 trillion, there is, expansion that will be happening on a number of different, very large dimensions.
Brian Taptich is the head of strategic initiatives at AWS, a seasoned operator, part of the leadership team at AWS. Brian has worked for some of the most disruptive and impactful companies in the US and has had just a fantastic career, which was a joy to unpack. We talked about the rise of generative AI and what that means for AWS. We talked about cybersecurity and cybersecurity threats in 2024, what AWS took from their experience of the pandemic, and not forgetting, we have to talk about it, the legendary work culture at Amazon.com and how that seeps into the culture and leads the culture at AWS. There was so much to talk about on that point that we stemmed in all sorts of directions. It was so interesting and so much more. What an unbelievable episode to start 2024. It is Brian Taptich. Brian Taptich, thank you so much for coming on the Tech Leaders podcast. I've been really excited to talk to you, but I understand you prefer to be addressed as Tap. Do you want to give us the little story behind that?
Oh, yeah, I'm happy to do that real quick. So when I was in kindergarten, I went to my dad's office, and everybody he was a lawyer, and everybody there called him Tap, and I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. But even when you're 5 years old, that you can't give yourself a nickname. And then I go off to university, flash forward 13 years, and I played American football and lacrosse in college, and you show up and they give you a gray t-shirt that says B Taptich, and nobody knows what the B stands for, and Taptich is a pain in the butt to say, so everyone starts calling me Tap. So Gareth, the punchline here is that dreams do come true.
Brilliant. I love that story. What a great way to start. But what we normally start with is this question, Tap. We're obviously a technology and leadership podcast. What does good leadership mean to you, Tap?
Yeah, this is an intimidating question coming onto your podcast, Gareth, because, you listen to all the really incredible answers that your previous guests have given. So there's just this accumulated pressure that you feel coming in. I would say that, and I've written about this before, the real key is striking the right balance between, developing the right product and business strategy and developing the right company culture. And I think more often than not, people spend way too much time, especially in Silicon Valley, especially around startups, figuring out the first bit, what is a cool product and what is our optimal go-to-market strategy, and spend not nearly enough time on the latter bit and developing culture. Look, the reality is that we in the technology industry have the good fortune of really having our selection of jobs, and especially amongst the top tier talent, employing people who are top tier talent, they can go anywhere they want to go.
Yeah.
And the difference between staying and going is not going to be about the product per se, or certainly not your go-to-market strategy. It's going to be, is it a place that I want to work, and is it with people I want to work, and is it a mission that I believe in?
Fantastic. Well, I'd give yourself a tap on the back, no pun intended. That was a great answer. That's very relatable, Tap, I would say. So I want to basically just give the listeners a little bit of an introduction to yourself. I know you've had a very long and successful career. You're a major in psychology. You got into the tech sector. Talk us through the sort of milestones early on in your career, Tap, that set you on the path that you ultimately ended up pursuing.
Yes, my liberal arts degree from Williams College in psychology and English literature, it wasn't the most logical path, was not getting into the tech industry. I ended up, after university, my dad likes to say I had my midlife crisis early. And so I jumped on a motorcycle and I spent a year traveling around the United States because I'd never really explored kind of everything there is to explore. And then I got done with that and I realized I'd never lived overseas in my first 18 years. So I decided to take a job teaching English in Japan, and I got placed in a tiny little town in the middle of nowhere and was teaching high school Japanese students how to speak English. And in the wake of that, it was time to get the career started. So I came back and I moved to San Francisco, and just by virtue of good timing, it was kind of, I moved there right as Netscape had released Navigator, and sort of the World Wide Web was sort of born. I was thinking a lot about teaching and writing and not at all about technology. And I stumbled into this job at this emerging magazine at the time called Red Herring, which was one of the tech business Bible, which grew into being one of the tech business Bibles in Silicon Valley, which really set me off on my path. And so I ended up spending 4 years there as kind of Silicon Valley was becoming what Silicon Valley became. Ended up starting a company after that called Alarm Clock Communications, which was also a print and web media company, which then ran headlong into sort of the dot-com crash in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
At which point, decided to go back to business school to kind of round out my business and leadership capabilities, and then had a series of jobs from there that culminated in my role today at AWS. So the first was I was running some product and business development at Electronic Arts in the games industry. From there, I got recruited away to help run at the time, a small startup called BitTorrent. And if you're of a certain age, you know BitTorrent.
I know BitTorrent.
Yes, you do. And I won't ask why.
That was a very important company, I think, around that time.
And in fact, BitTorrent was it was a really interesting proposition at the time because Bram Cohen, who had invented the protocol, and it was open source, but it was really an open source effort of one, had developed this really elegant technical architecture that he set out into the wild. And it turns out that people used it for things that he wasn't anticipating people to use it for. But it turns out also the architecture had tons of different applications other than just downloading pirated content.
Yeah.
And so the whole idea behind starting the company was to create kind of an enterprise version of this protocol, which we ended up doing, and to some success. From then, though, I was recruited back into the games industry, and a startup based in San Francisco called Zynga at the time, who made games like Farmville and Words with Friends and Mafia Wars for those who are real Zynga heads. And it was a wild ride. To this point in my career, I had kind of let the river take me where it will. And I started to get a little bit more intentional about how I thought about things. And I knew the next step I wanted was to be the CEO of a car company. And so I got recruited to be CEO of a company called Bitcasa, which had built a bunch of interesting file system services all on top of AWS. Ran that for 3.5, 4 years, ended up exiting to Intel, at which point I got recruited over to AWS. And I've been here for 6 years now.
And the rest is history, eh? But that's a great tour through your career there, Tap. I think there's a couple of things I wanted to ask you about, but maybe can I just start with this one, which I think is just super interesting. Silicon Valley in the 90s, okay? Are you detecting a similar vibe within the dot-com sort of era? A similar vibe these days in relation to the dawn of AI technology? Do you know what I mean? Is this a similar level of excitement?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of parallels, but I do think but more material, right? The challenge with the dot-com boom 1.0 of the late 90s was, to some degree, we all knew these businesses that were being started, as disruptive as they may seem, didn't have kind of sustainable and scalable business models to help support them. And the 90s, it was really more about entirely disrupting, existing brick and mortar businesses. It wasn't about how is Walmart going to develop its own web strategy. It was, hey, we're going to slice up the universe that is Walmart into thinner and thinner bits, and we're going to put it online. And sure, we're not going to make money on any single transaction, but we're going to make up for it on volume, which of course doesn't work, right? And so I think we all had this feeling then that the frothiness was doomed. It was just a function of when the other shoe was going to drop, and eventually it did. Right now, it's really less about, hey, how are new businesses going to disrupt existing businesses? It's how is this new technology going to enable companies everywhere to disrupt their own businesses, right? To do their businesses much more effectively, much more efficiently. And it's really less about, how are these tools that are being developed in Gen AI, going to entirely replace existing companies, existing businesses, existing products. And so I think that's the big fundamental difference. So it's not, it's not about, hey, how is generative AI going to displace AWS or Amazon from its leadership position in what it's currently doing. Rather, it's how is generative AI going to enable them to provide even better experiences for their customers, whether it's on the enterprise side or on the consumer side. And the same could be said of the automotive industry, the healthcare, life sciences industry, whatever it may be.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, can I just maybe draw some attention, or maybe home in on your time with Bitcasa then? Because I understand you took over and oversaw an enormous amount of growth there. There was a pretty impressive period of growth during that time. Looking back now, then Tap, what was your biggest lesson? Do you think from being a CEO at that organization? What are your sort of takeaways where you think I learned some serious lessons there? Where were those lessons?
Yeah, I think it's two bits. One is about not just making sure you have the right product and go to market strategy, which is sort of table stakes for any company, but also creating the right sort of culture. Because the reality is that we read all these headlines about, companies that are wildly successful and, have the luxury of recruiting anybody and everybody that they want. But the reality is the other 95% are companies that aren't these huge unicorn rocket ships, right? That are struggling, whether it's with their product development, their product market fit, their go to market strategy. And so, objectively, on its face, getting people to come work for companies like those is really, really hard, right? I mean,
Yeah.
of course, we always want the A plus talent to come join us. The challenge is that you can't always get the A plus talent, either because you can't afford them, because it turns out we live in a competitive marketplace, or because, in a world where they have their choice of jobs, like, why am I going to go to a struggling company when I can go to one of these rocket ships? And so it really then you have to kind of compete on culture. And so it was really about creating a culture that was attracting people and who believed in the mission and believed in
Yeah.
what we were trying to do as much as our product and go to market fit.
Yeah, for sure. I can imagine the talent war in Silicon Valley at a time of a boom period. Well, in general, actually, but especially in a boom period. I bet it's brutal. I bet it's such a transactional marketplace, isn't it? You know what I mean? If someone's unhappy, they can get a new job like that. I'm talking about people like engineers and those kind of in demand skills like that. I bet it's brutal. Has that been sort of a challenging part of growth and your career as a leader within in the tech industry?
Absolutely. And this is, one, it's brutal. It's brutal. The baseline is it's brutal, right? It's brutal under any circumstances. And whether you're Bitcasa, struggling turnaround venture back startup, or whether you're AWS, the 800-pound gorilla in the cloud services space, when it comes to attracting and retaining talent, we have the exact same challenges, just a different set of ammunition that we kind of bring to the fight. And to your point, in boom times, it just gets, irrationally brutal. And so
Yeah.
again, this is why culture, becomes every bit as important as what your business and your go to market strategy is. I would say the other thing, and you asked specifically about leadership, it was actually subsequent. It was right after the board meeting where we talked about the emergency board meeting, where we talked about how we needed time to come up with a new strategy because the existing strategy was intrinsically flawed. That one of my board members pulled me aside and he gave me one of the two best pieces of leadership advice that I've ever gotten. And he pulled me aside and said, "Look, Tap, I know this is your first time as a CEO. The thing you got to understand is the key to being a CEO is you're a benevolent dictator. Like, that's what CEOs are. CEOs are benevolent dictators. The great CEOs know when to be benevolent and when to be a dictator." And I've kind of taken that to heart.
That's brilliant advice. I'm gonna have to remember that one, Tap. I think that's really good. You joined obviously Amazon in summer of 2017. What surprised you most about AWS and the organization that you joined at that time?
Oh, how different the laws of physics are at AWS was the biggest shock. And what I mean when I say that is that anytime that a company is going after kind of a $3 to $4 trillion addressable market, which is kind of how we think about it. So if you imagine that historically any workload, any process, any service, any product that kind of has been run on existing on-premises services, on-premises servers, or a server closet that you might happen to have in your company, ultimately all of those things are going to live in the cloud someday.
Yeah.
um, when the denominator is that large and the opportunity is so huge, it requires kind of a different way of thinking. And by the way, especially culture shocking coming from a venture backed turnaround small startup. And I'll tell you, I wasn't at all sure when I came to join that this was going to be a good fit, because my background was much more kind of small company entrepreneurial. And
Yeah.
in fact, as part of the transaction with Intel, the reason I didn't go there is that I wasn't interested in joining a big company. And then AWS called a few weeks later, and we talked for a couple of months, and I ended up landing over here, despite the fact that at the time Amazon, I think, was 2.5 times the size of Intel. So the biggest shock was what kind of the laws of physics are just different. And
Yeah.
I think when I joined, and it's proven out, right? When I joined, Amazon at the time was about 600,000 employees, which I remember in my first day training, when they said that number, my jaw hit the floor. I couldn't even imagine anything that large. And
Yeah.
AWS run rate at the time was around $12 billion. Well, flash forward just 6 years later, and AWS is now a $90 billion run rate company
Yeah.
in just 6 years, from 12 to 90. And Amazon is 1.4, I think roughly 1.4 million person company. So just adjusting to that rate of growth, that overall size, and the scope and scale of the opportunity,
Yeah, for
um,
sure.
is kind of the biggest shock.
I can imagine. It's crazy numbers, that is. I mean, I didn't realize that they were quite that big in terms of headcount. But so AWS, how closely integrated is AWS into Amazon, into the mothership? Is it regarded as like sort of a department? I know it's a big company in its own right, but how close it is to this sort of centralized culture of Amazon is AWS?
Oh, really good question. Again, with this culture theme keeps coming through. One of the reasons that Amazon has been able to sort of grow as aggressively and successfully as it has is because it has such a strong culture. I mean, anybody who's done sort of any research at all on Amazon knows about sort of the leadership principles, which are,
Yeah.
when I joined, 14 and now 16 of our leadership principles. And I've experienced lots of companies where the leadership principles are, great fodder for posters on the wall, or mouse pads if they still exist, or coasters or whatever. At Amazon, these things are real and people genuinely live by them. And it's what's enabled the company kind of to grow and still maintain its consistency, its of culture. And AWS is very much a part of it. I mean, the genesis of AWS was, Amazon's philosophy has always been, if we're going to build something, let's build it in a way that it can be platformized, it can be productized for other people to consume from. And so, what started on the Amazon.com side with, hey, let's let third party sellers use our platform because we're never going to be able to satisfy all the demand that's out there, was very much that's what the germination for AWS, where Andy Jassy, who 17 years ago founded AWS, is now the CEO of all of
Yeah.
Amazon.com, came along and
Yeah.
said, what we can do? We've built this underlying tech platform that supports Amazon.com. Let's take that and productize it and let other people benefit from our learnings and our scale as well. Now, as a result, and especially with Andy now in charge of it, AWS is not only technically, an intrinsic part to what Amazon.com is doing, because it all runs on top of AWS, but then culturally, it's never been considered separate. It's a business unit, but everything we do there is run is run the same way.
Oh, okay. So in terms of technology innovation, then obviously, I mean, AWS is synonymous with cloud computing now, isn't it? It's very much, it kind of owns that space. I mean, obviously, I know Microsoft are very strong in that space as well, and Google have got their own product. So in terms of like innovation, and maybe we can come on to Amazon Q and AI technology at some point. But I just think in terms of tech innovation, how much do AWS influence Amazon's innovation around any sort of software and
Yeah.
technology? Is it a driver? Is it or do you get told to do by them, or do you set strategy for Amazon? Do you know what I mean? What does that relationship look like from a technology perspective, Tap?
It's also a good question. And it also gets to one of the things that I think differentiates Amazon from any place I've ever worked. By the way, the most striking, immediately obvious thing that makes Amazon feel different than other companies is that it's all document writing at Amazon. So I haven't used a PowerPoint except to launch it for stuff that people have sent me from outside. since I started working here. Like I haven't made a single PowerPoint presentation since I got here. It's all document based. And it's a very trippy experience your first handful of meetings when you come here and you're accustomed to sitting down around a table and somebody puts up a PowerPoint presentation and starts going through slides and speaking to them, and kind of you sit there and you receive, and then there's an interaction. In when you walk into a meeting at Amazon, invariably there's either a piece of paper, a stack of papers, or a document that somebody shared digitally. And the first quarter of the meeting, whether it's a half hour, 2 hours, 6 hour meeting, is just
Yeah.
spent reading. It's silent.
I've
Um,
heard this. I've heard this actually. Yeah, Amazon acquired a company in Wales, basically called Vico,
yeah,
and
sure.
they immediately introduced this into the culture at Vico. They had to spend 10, 15, 20 minutes reading, which is I think is genius because then nobody in that meeting has got any excuse. Even if they haven't read the stuff they should have read, they can read it now. So therefore, everyone's on the same page. I think that's fantastic that they've rolled that out.
Yeah, and two additional really important points with this. And this is why I don't think I'll ever go back to PowerPoint culture. That hopefully I retire from AWS, but if that doesn't happen and I join other companies, I'm not sure I could ever go back to PowerPoint, because the thing that it enables, it very much kind of levels the playing field in that, when you're walking through a PowerPoint presentation, the person who's created the presentation already knows what's coming next, but nobody else does. And so it's sort of this non-linear process. Whereas in the doc writing culture, everybody consumes what's on the page and has the full story to then be able to ask questions about, instead of just bits and pieces along the way. And so it very much kind of democratizes on one level.
Hmm.
The second is it's very sort of standard practice that the most senior person in the room goes last. And so when we would do doc reads with Jeff and now Andy, they always go last because they don't want their questions or their directions to kind of influence the other people in the room. And so
Yeah.
there's this kind of unspoken but natural hierarchy of
Sure.
feedback that you get. Is super valuable.
This episode is brought to you by Be Digital UK. Be Digital are a trusted partner to leadership teams of technology driven organizations, delivering ROI led solutions across cost optimization and also data and AI adoption.
AWS doesn't really influence how Amazon.com works.
Mm,
AWS really enables Amazon.com to do what it needs to do. And this gets to a very important tenet at Amazon, which is working back from customers, right? Another thing that's been sort of shocking, and it's very different about working here, is I've never been in a meeting where the first question is, how much money can we make from this? Right? It's the first question is always, what is the big hairy customer problem that we're solving? And the
yeah,
presumption
sure.
being that, look, if we really focus on customer requirements and we build the things that solve the biggest, most challenging customer problems, the money will subsequently follow. So it's
Yeah,
really
sure.
about working back from customers and solving customer problems, not, and so in the case of Amazon and AWS, we're not telling Amazon what to do. To the contrary, they're telling us what their requirements are. We're building technologies and services that support not just them, but also the rest of our AWS customer base. And just as everybody else benefits from the work that we do for Amazon.com, Amazon.com benefits from the work that we're doing for everybody else as well. And you know we consider Amazon.com in the same light and with the same gravity that we would any one of our other customers.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's really, really, really interesting stuff. I mean, it kind of feels like a little bit of a given now that you obsess about the customer and work back from that point. But I can recall, Amazon just working in that way, or even just articulating it in that way. I would call it revolutionary. I don't think anyone really had thought about it like that. You know what I mean? It was always about the profit and the top line, bottom line. It was never about most companies thought of it in that way. And it was a bit of a paradigm shift, I would say.
100%. And this is where, and this predates me by a significant margin, but that DNA that Jeff sort of set very early on. And you'll remember when, Amazon.com went public, and Jeff's first shareholder letter is one of the artifacts that everybody who comes into Amazon reads, because he very much sets the tone, that had not successfully been set previously in the public markets, which is, look, we're in this for long-term growth and we're willing to trade sort of short-term profitability and quarter-to-quarter focus to think about years, decades, and the payoff will come. And it's proven out over and over and over again. And so it was revolutionary. But again, I don't want to sound too judgmental. I don't think there are lots of right ways to do things.
Yeah, sure.
This is the way that really has worked for Amazon and has kept the culture so strong since sort
Yeah.
of he set that DNA, decades ago.
Let's talk about the pandemic very quickly then, Tap. How did the pandemic change AWS in terms of like what changes did you make from that period which have stayed in place from a cultural standpoint more than anything else, or maybe from a structural standpoint in terms of the way you guys lead teams and things? Anything sort of stand out as maybe positive things that you've kept as a result of the pandemic period?
I'd say a few things. Again, back to the leadership principles. One is a continued focus on one of our key leadership principles, which is bias for action. Right? Is we had going into the pandemic, like moving with a sense of urgency and really believing that speed matters is something that Andy has long espoused and believes in and driven down into the organization. And bias for action sort of is the leadership principle that manifests that. Now, the one of the things that we found is, through a global pandemic, you had lots and lots of businesses that were, just being thrown upside down and didn't know what to do. And beyond the usual set of business as usual requirements that we're getting from customers, just an extraordinary amount of new requirements that people were coming. And so really making sure that the organization was moving quickly through the pandemic was wildly important, all of course while having to do it working remotely. And I think we, like everybody else, realized that where uh, through the course of those 2.5 to 3 years, where being together, where we missed it, where we saw the value in being in an office and collaborating and being close together, like where that really mattered. And maybe, also a handful of areas where, it wasn't as important. Right. And so I think about the amount of business travel has gone down pretty considerably because you realize that maybe pre-pandemic, you felt like you were obligated to make that cross country trip for that meeting with that one guy, to then turn around and come right back. Well, not doing much of that anymore. I think like most people realizing that, now with the acceptance of video calling, we can just do that more efficiently and more effectively, more frugally. And by the way, frugality is another one of our leadership principles. And so just understanding where in the business, where in the culture, it is important for people to be coming back together, and where maybe the marginal return isn't quite worth it, and putting a fine point on those.
Yeah, I think everyone's been through a similar journey to that. What I think some organizations haven't done so well is that they've maybe deviated away from their core principles as a result of some of the changes that were initiated by the pandemic situation. Do you know what I mean? It sounds like AWS have completely remained true to the original, certainly from a leadership perspective, which is really refreshing, I suppose.
I will say though, Gareth, I think there is something there though, which is with so much growth that a lot of companies, including ours, went through the pandemic. You've got a community of people who have started, and know nothing other than working at a particular company, working remotely, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not easy, right? If you've joined and you're in a remote location and you've been accustomed to joining via video conference to everything that you're doing, to then be asked to come into the office, can be a shock to the system. But I think what we found is that, once you get through that initial shock and once people sort of remember, what the before time was like when we were all in the same place and could be that much more productive and efficient, convincing people to come back has been more straightforward, is one thing I'd say. And the other thing I'd say is I think that there are also big cultural differences here, right? And so, what we're seeing is that, and we it's a little bit more challenged for people in places like the US and maybe parts of Western Europe. But when you travel to Asia or Latin America, there's just much less hesitancy on people coming back into the office. There's much greater willingness to come back into the office. And I'm sure some of that has to do with culture, some of that has to do with available space at home. But there is some variability there.
Yeah, there is. I think a lot of it depends on the individual. And I think a lot of it depends on where they are at in their career as well. I personally think if you are in it earlier on in your career, then you probably are going to benefit from being around experienced people all the time. You know what I mean? Not, and I'm not talking about on Teams calls or Google or Meet, video calls. I'm talking about just the sort of serendipity of being in an office, having a conversation by the water cooler about somebody who's got a specific problem. You just can't replicate that, can you? When you're working from home, it's very difficult to replicate
You
that.
really can't. And Ian Wilson, who runs HR for all of AWS, he's got a couple different variants on the same expression, which is Amazon.com culture, you know, can be learned, but is mostly earned. Or
I
you could
love
say
that.
it can be taught, but it's mostly caught, right? And I don't think Amazon.com has a very strong culture, but I think that's true of any company, right? Which is
Yeah, sure.
there's a degree to which you can kind of push it out to the edge, but at the end of the day, you're absolutely right. The way you're going to get acculturated, the way you're going to get assimilated is by that serendipity, by that human contact.
Yeah, for sure. Completely agree. Let's talk about the product very quickly then. How do you see AWS evolving over the next 5 years in terms of the product offering?
That is a big question. I think, again, in a universe where you're a $90 billion company and you see your addressable market as $3 to $4 trillion, there is expansion that will be happening on a number of different very large dimensions. What we will continue to do, is offer the broadest and deepest array of services that customers can access in the cloud. That's across the entirety of the stack. So whether it's at the bottom of the stack, or if you're thinking about, our compute and storage services, everything from, new storage types that make data more affordably and more accessible, whether you're talking about compute instances that are continue to push, like we do with our Graviton instances, which are, custom silicon that we build that really pushes the limits of kind of price performance of all of our services to, we talk about generative AI and AI. We have evolving our compute instances in that direction. So things like our inferentia chips, which are optimized price performance for doing inference with your AI models, or
Oh, wow. Okay.
Trainium, which is optimized for doing training for your models. So at that level of the stack, there's a number of different dimensions that are going to be where we're going to see innovation in the next 5 years or so. A layer up from there, you talk about sort of our database and analytics layer, and a lot of interesting stuff that's happening across in databases and our analytics products, where you have sort of zero ETL products, which sort of accelerate the ability for customers to run their workloads. A ton of opportunity there. And then sort of up at the application layer, and this is where, when we think about Gen AI, we think about all of these layers, but
Yeah.
just increased productivity application development, whether it's, our collection of kind of connect call center tools or our end user applications like workspaces. There are a lot of different directions. And obviously, I suspect we'll segue to Gen AI as a really key driver, not just in the
Sure.
short term, but, over the next decades.
Yeah, sure. Everyone's talking about Gen AI at the moment. So I did want to ask you about that, Tap. I think ultimately, what are you most excited about in terms of generative AI's impact on the AWS product in terms of what's in store? I know you had the annual conference recently. How are you going to integrate generative AI capability into AWS, and how is that going to improve the product?
Yeah, I sort of referred before to kind of the three layers in the AWS stack, and that it applies very much to the generative AI area. First off, we're very much believers that this is going to be transformational technology, and not pets.com transformational, which sort of evaporated, but long term, this is really going to transform the way you know consumers are, what the way companies are creating products and services for their consumers, all the way back to the way in which coders are going to be writing code to provide all of those services to both customers and enterprises. And I'll tell you again, we think about generative AI and sort of those three layers of the stack, and the first is at the infrastructure layer. Already you're seeing pretty significant requirements that are coming along as a result of people using generative AI and rolling it out in production, which is, what people don't realize is that it's not magic. At the end of the day, it requires an incredible amount of processing power and an incredible amount of
Yeah.
electrical power to run these models, to actually do the work. And I think, early on, a lot of people started fooling around with the technology and then got sticker shock when they realized how much it actually costs to do those things. And what the cloud is able broadly to do is to provide that scale of computing power that people will be using to run their generative AI, whether it's their foundational models, their large
Yeah,
language
sure.
models, or any other applications. And so the ability to offer that at the broadest size and scale is a real advantage that we have at AWS. Layered on top of that, the custom silicon innovation we're doing, whether it's with Graviton or with Trainium or with Inferentia, that not only drives the scale, but also drives the price performance. And so we're really excited about that layer. A layer
Yeah,
up from that is, sort of our bedrock layer, which is that's where AWS's philosophy has always been to democratize kind of the accessibility of these tools to whoever might want to use them, whether it's
sure.
a venture-backed startup or whether it's the largest enterprise. And so we've launched Amazon Bedrock, which is provides access to anybody to the broadest array of models that are available. We don't believe that there's going to be one model that's going to kill them all. We believe that there are going to be a number of different foundational models on top of which people are going to build a ton of customized models that are optimized for their own particular types of applications. And so what Amazon Bedrock does is it gives people access to a range of different models. And we just had our big reInvent conference with a bunch of announcements, including, Anthropic, which is, one of the well-known
Oh, yeah. That's Claude, yeah?
foundational models there. Yep. So Claude 2.0 is now available on Bedrock, and Meta's
Right.
Llama 270B is now available. So, there are now, I think, around half a dozen models that people can use Bedrock and access in a super safe and secure way.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's kind of like a managed service then, or it's like a managed combination of all the different models. So you can sort of make an informed decision about what model is right for you. Then is that pretty much what it is? Tap? Would you say?
Yes, yes, and it is that. And it's also the ability to do all those things in a really sort of safe and secure way. Because,
Yeah, sure.
you know, very early on, there was a lot of excitement. And I think one of the things that people realized pretty quickly, one I alluded to before, which is the sticker shock of actually doing work on some of these models, they can get very expensive very quickly. And two is, real concerns about sort of the safety and privacy, the security and privacy of, you know, the way in which you're using some of these models. And so, you would have at large enterprises, we've heard a number of stories from large enterprises who an engineer, a DevOps engineer somewhere at the edge who decided that they were going to do some proofs of concept with some of these open source available models, and before they knew it had basically like contributed all of their data to the training the open source,
Yeah,
and it opened themselves up to security and privacy concerns that they had no idea they were getting into. So
yeah,
yes,
sure.
it is about giving people the choice and providing this kind of security and privacy that people need so that they don't put themselves at risk.
Yeah, for sure. So, can I just please zoom you out now, then, Tap, from the AWS focus here, and I
Yeah.
just want to get some macro thoughts from you in terms of the AI picture more broadly. How do we ensure that AI is developed and deployed ethically and responsibly? Do you have any thoughts on how we can achieve that as an industry?
Yeah, sure. You look, I think we believe that generative AI is going to be transformational. We believe there is a great deal of risk, and some of the risk we talked about around security and privacy and people maintaining control of their data and deploying it only in the ways in which are productive for them and not
Yeah,
made more broadly available. And so I do think that there is the opportunity. Responsible AI is a subject that we've helped pioneer and are taking very seriously. And at the
yeah.
end of the day, it's going to be some combination of the commercial sector and regulators, getting to a place where we're not stifling innovation, but the innovation that is happening is being done in a responsible way.
Yeah, it's such a big topic right now, isn't it? But I think it is something we just have to tread very carefully, don't we, with this stuff? Because it is really, really, it could be the best thing that's ever happened to the human race if we do it correctly. But also, it could have negative connotations if we don't. So, what kind of stuff are you? What are you most excited about in terms of general AI? Then,
I think you're seeing a lot of advancements. I think the ChatGPT came out, and it was a very kind of tangible manifestation of the power that Gen AI could sort of bring to bear, right? And
yeah,
so you're seeing this early innovation in content generation, as an example, right? And so whether that's creating levels for video games or writing term papers for students, note to students, don't do that.
that's a very real thing. That is, we've got to be careful about, isn't it? Things like that.
It certainly is. And to helping coders write code, right? You're already seeing a groundswell of innovation that's happening there. And what AWS is trying to do is kind of take that generalized groundswell and shape it into products that, again, allow for that speed of innovation, but also give people the safety and security to know that, hey, if you're using our set of tools, you don't have to worry about your personal data, your customer data. And so we have a model called Amazon Titan, and we announced at reInvent Amazon Titan Image Generator, which helps people create images using natural language prompts,
Yeah,
again in a very safe and secure way. And Amazon Q was probably the biggest announcement we made at reInvent, and
yeah,
that's a Gen AI powered assistant that people can direct at their own proprietary data and get answers back about. It could be about their customer experience. It could be about a particular ad campaign. It could be about any one of a number of things. And so right now we're seeing it around content generation. I think the real potential is going to be coming, and hopefully in a very responsible way, where you start to see sort of the amplification of that, where models are just going to get smarter and smarter about particular use cases
yeah.
and just get much more refined. And so all of the good news is, as consumers, at the end of the day, all of our experience are just going to be much, much better. And we believe we can do it in a way that just makes it much, much safer for all of us.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's really, really reassuring for sure. But so a couple of things then to end. I just wanted to ask you some questions about yourself, Tap. You're a very busy guy, lots of responsibility, lots of impact in the decisions that you make. How do you remain productive on a daily basis, and how do you achieve balance in your life?
That's a good question. And by the way, especially difficult in the age of video conferencing now,
Yeah,
because it's always too easy to just sit there and continue working or take another meeting, or because particularly if you're working from home, the distance from your office, which is usually a spare bedroom, or your actual bedroom, to the living room, is a lot shorter than getting in a car and heading home. So it's become even more of a challenge. I'd say productivity. Look, all of us has 58 things that we need to do, and we have time to do 23 of them, right? And so step one is just being really rigorous in how you're prioritizing the things that are your attention is focused on. In one of my roles here at AWS, I was managing a worldwide team of over 4,000 people, and without that sort of rigorous prioritization, you can very quickly get overwhelmed with all the inputs. Step two is, so rigorously prioritize. Step two is, just make sure you have the best possible team. Another one of the Amazon leadership principles is hire and develop the best. And
yeah,
the reality is that none of us can scale without having an incredible team of people that you can delegate the difference between your 58 and your 23. And then the third is mechanisms. And this is another big tenet at Amazon, where one of the other things that they have you watch when you're kind of onboarding here at Amazon is a speech that Jeff gave, where he talks about the difference between good intentions and mechanisms. And good intentions is, yeah, I think I'll try and get that done. Mechanisms is to say, no, this is the goal. Here's the way in which we're going to audit that goal, usually in some recurring set of meetings,
yeah,
um,
sure.
and then report back on the success of that goal.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
rigorously prioritize, have a great team, get your mechanisms in place, and then just run.
Yeah, it's like accountability, isn't it? That's really good advice. If you could have a coffee with anyone in the world, who would you take the opportunity to spend some time with?
I think Stephen Hawking would probably be at the top of my list.
Oh, wow, interesting choice. Yeah,
I
fantastic.
Not just because he's got maybe the biggest brain, but I read this thing where he was talking about graduating from Oxford, I believe. I'm not sure I'm going to get that right, but
Yeah, I believe it was Oxford. Yeah.
I think it was Oxford too. In any event, he was deciding what field of science he wanted to go into, and he said that at the time, because he was smarter than the rest of us, he was thinking about it very intentionally. And he said, "Well, I thought about microbiology and I thought about astrophysics, and microbiology because it's the very very small, and astrophysics because it's the very very large." He said he chose astrophysics because he felt like there was a limit to how small something could get, but there was no limit to how large something could get. And so,
Great. Yeah.
that kind of, I don't know that I would be able to learn much from it, but just to understand, the mind of somebody who sort of thinks that logically and intentionally, I think would be fascinating.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Are you into reading, Tap? You got any books you've been inspired by?
So for me, it's a very personal thing. There's a book called Blue Highways, A Journey into America. And it was written by this Native American author called William Least Heat Moon in the early 80s. And Blue
Okay.
Highways refers to secondary streets in the United States. And it's travel log. He spent a year traveling around the United States and he stuck just to the Blue Highways. So stay off the big roads, stay off the interstates, really get to know kind of the heart and soul of people. And,
Yeah.
that sowed the seed for what became my trip around the United States to then my time in Japan to then really my professional career. And I think on two levels. One is a more existential level, like, hey, make sure you get off the interstates, right? Like whatever the metaphorical version is of that for you. Make sure
Yeah.
you're
Sure.
really diving deep and understanding kind of what's going on, off the main highway, because it's the
Oh, I
only way
love
you're going to
that.
understand what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is one, and
That's
two, it sort of sowed the seeds for what now, coming out of college, I was very kind of myopically focused in my universe, and just opened me up to not just the rest of America, but the rest of the world. So anyway, it's highly personal, but I want everybody to read it.
I think that makes total sense. And that is Blue Highways, A Journey into America by William Least Heat Moon. Yeah.
That's correct. That is it.
We will put that on the show notes so people can find that. So let's end on this one then, Tap. Looking back now over your career, what advice would you give to your 21-year-old self? What would you say to that guy, knowing what you know now?
I'll say two things equally true. One is I wouldn't do it over again differently, and two is I definitely didn't choose the path of least resistance. Sort of going from a motorcycle to teaching English in Japan to writing for a tech business publication to then getting into the business of technology. I look back and I see with some professional envy. I don't have a lot of personal envy, but professional envy for the people who graduated and went to work for McKinsey and then went to work for Google and then went to that sort of more traditional path. If the latter, I think, is not interesting enough, the former is a little too interesting. And so I would probably tell myself to be a little bit more intentional in how I think about things. I was sort of
Yeah, that
very
makes sense.
Taoist in my approach, and letting the river kind of find its own way. And at
Yeah,
some point,
sure.
you have to actually guide the river.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I mean, I think that's very relatable, and I think that will certainly resonate with many people. But where can people find you, by the way? And if they want to reach out or keep an eye on what you guys are doing.
Sure. Well, first off, everybody go to aws.amazon.com and look at all the amazing products and services and features that we have. You can find me and all the standard social media channels. LinkedIn is probably the most appropriate, and I'm easy to find because my name is unusual.
Yeah, it is indeed. Yeah, Brian Taptich. Yeah, where does that name come from? I've not come across that surname before.
It is Slovak, and despite the fact that I almost came to blows with a Croatian doorman at a hotel I stayed at once who insisted that it was Croatian. I said, no. My grandmother actually came over from Slovakia, so I actually know, but he was very insistent that it was Croatian. Anyway, it is Slovak, and I think right now the number of Taptiches in the United States is like less than 30, so it's kind of a point of pride. Yeah.
But look, Tap, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a joy. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you for coming on the Tech Leaders podcast. so many interesting things to choose from here, but what really stood out for me was the relationship between AWS and Amazon. I think AWS has just become such a massive brand in its own right that it's almost kind of feels like it's broke off and is very autonomous. But Brian was saying how Amazon.com still drives everything from a cultural perspective, and the impact of Amazon.com can be felt through everything AWS do, especially in relation to things like the no PowerPoint and the more document-based way that they operate, right through to the 20 minutes at the beginning of every meeting, which I thought was a really cool snapshot of the culture at Amazon there. And also, I think the main one is the mantra of just working back from the customer was the big problem you're trying to solve for the customer, and just obsessing with that emphasis as opposed to trying to work concentrating on where you're going to make revenue with the customer. I think it's just solving the customer problem and being obsessed with that it has to be an enormous part of why Amazon have been so successful. It's just, I thought that was very insightful and really interesting. Yeah, so I mean, that was just one of many things we could have talked about. It was a fantastic episode. Happy New Year to everybody. Thank you so much for your support. Please give us a like, a subscribe, and a download. Very much appreciated. Have a great start to 2024. Happy New Year.